3 times. 3 different centuries. 3 moments when money quietly took control. Those moments weren't random. There's a pattern in history that has undermined every democracy in the last 330 years. Not through invasion, not through revolution, but through something quieter, something most people never see until it's too late. In 1694, England became the first nation to hand control of its money to private bankers. Within a century, those bankers held more power than the king. In 1913, the United States did the same thing at a secret meeting on an island off the Georgia coast. Within a century, those same financial interests controlled more wealth than the bottom 90% of Americans combined. In 2010, the Supreme Court made it legal for unlimited money to flow into elections. Within a decade, 94% of congressional races were won by whoever spent more money. 3 times. 3 different centuries. 3 moments when money quietly took control. And here's what should terrify you. The average citizen in America today has near zero influence on government policy. Not reduced influence, near zero. Meanwhile, economic elites and business interests have what researchers call substantial independent impacts on what becomes law. This isn't opinion. This is peer-reviewed research from Princeton University. You don't live in a democracy. You live in a financial system. And the takeover wasn't loud. There were no coups, no dictators, no military juntas. Just quiet meetings, legal decisions, and banking innovations that slowly, methodically transferred power from the people to those who control the money. This is the story of how money stopped being a tool and became the master, how a system designed to serve us trapped us instead, and why every attempt to break free only tightens the grip. The pattern has played out 3 times. Each time they thought it was different. Each time money won. And we're deep into the 4th cycle right now, before money controlled everything. It was supposed to be simple, a medium of exchange, a tool to make trade easier. You grow wheat, I raise cattle. Instead of bartering, we use tokens that represent value. Gold coins, silver pieces, paper notes backed by something tangible. For centuries, that's all money was. A servant of human needs, facilitating prosperity, enabling commerce. But here's what nobody tells you about money. It only works because we believe in it. Money is a shared illusion, a collective story we all agree to participate in. A piece of paper has no inherent value. The numbers in your bank account are just data. The whole system runs on trust, on faith, on the belief that the symbols we've created represent something real. And that's where the trap begins. Because once you understand that money is belief, you understand that whoever controls the belief controls everything. If you can make people need your currency, if you can make them borrow it, if you can make repayment impossible, you don't need armies. You don't need laws. You have something more powerful. You have a system trap. A self-perpetuating cycle where debt creates dependency, dependency creates control, and control creates more debt. Let me show you the numbers. Global debt right now is $337 trillion. The entire world's annual economic output is about $100 trillion. That means humanity owes more than 3 times what we produce in a year. The United States alone owes $36 trillion in federal debt. Add household debt, student loans, mortgages, credit cards, and the number exceeds $50 trillion. Just the interest payments on federal debt are approaching $1 trillion annually. That's more than the defense budget, more than Medicare, more than anything except Social Security. We're paying $1 trillion a year just to service debt, not to reduce it, just to keep it from imploding. And here's the trap. That debt is owned by someone. Banks, investment funds, foreign governments, wealthy individuals. Every dollar of debt is an asset on someone else's balance sheet, which means the people who hold the debt profit from the interest payments. Your mortgage payment flows to a bank. Your student loan payment enriches a lender. Government bond payments transfer from taxpayers to bondholders. It's a wealth transfer mechanism operating 24/7, pulling money from the many to the few. And most people never see it because it's not called a tax. It's called debt service. This is the baseline, the world we live in, where money doesn't just facilitate exchange anymore. It rules through debt, through inflation, through the quiet power of compound interest. And the people who designed this system understood exactly what they were building. The first turning point came in 1694. England was at war with France. King William III needed money desperately. The royal treasury was empty. Traditional lenders were refusing new loans because England had defaulted before. A Scottish merchant named William Paterson approached the king with a proposal that would change civilization. He would organize wealthy merchants to lend the government £1.2 million. But here's the innovation. The loan would never be repaid. Instead, the government would pay interest forever, 8% annually, guaranteed by Parliament, backed by the government's power to tax its citizens. To manage this arrangement, Paterson proposed creating the Bank of England. The mechanics were revolutionary. The merchant lenders gave their gold to the bank lent it to the government paid interest from tax revenue, and the bank distributed that interest to the merchants. But the principal, the original loan, would never be repaid, ever. Parliament approved the scheme. The Bank of England was chartered, and for the first time in history, national debt became permanent. Not a problem to solve, a feature of the system. Think about what this means. Before 1694, if a king borrowed money and couldn't repay, he defaulted. The creditor lost money, the system cleared. But Patterson's innovation made debt eternal. The government pays interest forever. The debt never disappears, it just grows. Within 50 years, every major European power copied the model. Permanent government debt became the foundation of state finance. And the people who held that debt, the bankers and merchants, quietly became more powerful than kings. Because when the government owes you money in perpetuity, when the interest payments depend on your continued cooperation, you don't need a throne. You have something better, you have leverage. By the early 1800s, one family understood this better than anyone, the Rothschilds. Starting as money changers in Frankfurt, 5 brothers established banking houses in 5 major European cities: London, Paris, Vienna, Naples, Frankfurt. This network gave them unprecedented power. They could move money across borders faster than anyone else, and they used this to dominate sovereign debt. Nathan Rothschild in London was the strategic genius. During the Napoleonic Wars, he didn't just lend to governments, he restructured how sovereign debt worked. Instead of lending directly, he bought government bonds at a discount and resold them to investors at a markup. He created a secondary market. This made debt tradable. A British bond might be owned by a French investor who sold it to a German bank, who used it as collateral for a loan to an Austrian aristocrat. The web of ownership became so complex that defaulting wasn't just refusing one creditor, it was collapsing an entire international financial network. And here's where it gets darker. In 1815, at the Battle of Waterloo, Nathan Rothschild learned of Napoleon's defeat before anyone else in London. His courier network was faster than official channels. He used this information to manipulate the bond market. First, he sold British bonds, signaling Britain was losing. Prices collapsed. Other investors panicked and sold. Then, after prices crashed, Rothschild bought massive quantities at rock-bottom prices. When news of British victory arrived the next day, bond prices surged. Rothschild made millions. This established the template. Control the information, control the issuance, control the market. By 1820, if a European government needed to borrow, they went through the Rothschilds. Because the Rothschilds controlled the investor network, the distribution channels, the terms. There's a quote widely attributed to Mayer Amschel Rothschild, the family patriarch. "Give me control of a nation's money supply, and I care not who makes its laws." Whether he actually said it doesn't matter. What matters is that it's true. Control the currency and credit, and you control everything else. Laws become secondary, elections become theater, because whoever controls the money sets the terms everyone else must accept. The pattern accelerated in America. By 1900, the United States was an economic powerhouse, but it had a primitive financial system. Banks operated independently. There was no central mechanism to manage money supply or coordinate during crises. In 1907, a financial panic crashed stock prices and seized the economy. J.P. Morgan, the most powerful banker in America, personally organized a bailout. He gathered major New York bankers in his library, locked the doors, and forced them to pledge their own money to stabilize failing banks. It worked. The panic ended. Morgan became the de facto central banker of America. But he was 70 years old. He knew he couldn't do it again. So in November 1910, Morgan's associates held a secret meeting. The location was Jekyll Island, Georgia, a private retreat accessible only by boat. The attendees were the most powerful bankers in America: Nelson Aldrich, a U.S. Senator; Frank Vanderlip of National City Bank; Henry Davison of J.P. Morgan; Paul Warburg of Kuhn, Loeb and Company. They traveled in a private rail car. They used only first names. They told the press they were going duck hunting. The meeting lasted 9 days. And in those 9 days, they designed what would become the Federal Reserve System. The design was brilliant political manipulation. They knew Americans hated central banks. The first and second banks of the United States had been shut down by populist opposition. So they disguised it. They wouldn't call it a central bank. They'd call it a Federal Reserve System. Not one institution. 12 regional banks. Not controlled by Wall Street, overseen by a board appointed by the president. It looked decentralized, democratic, public, but the structure ensured banker control. The regional Federal Reserve banks would be privately owned by member banks. Those banks would elect the boards of the regional feds. And the most important power, the power to create money and buy government bonds, was given to the Federal Reserve Bank of New York. which was controlled by the largest Wall Street banks, Morgan's banks. The Federal Reserve Act passed Congress in December 1913. Most representatives didn't understand what they were voting for. Some didn't even read it. And immediately, the debt trap expanded. Now, the government didn't just borrow from banks. It borrowed from the Federal Reserve, which could create money to buy bonds. Unlimited demand for government debt. Here's why this matters. Before the Federal Reserve, there was a limit to how much the government could borrow. Banks only had so much money to lend, but the Federal Reserve could create money by purchasing government bonds. The government issues a bond. The Fed buys it with newly created money. The government spends the money. The debt goes on the Fed's balance sheet, and the interest payments flow from taxpayers to the banks that own the Federal Reserve System. This is the mechanism that enables infinite debt. The Federal Reserve ensures there's always a buyer for government bonds, always demand, so the government never has to stop borrowing. It can roll over debt forever because the Fed will always buy it. J.P. Morgan died in 1913, the same year the Federal Reserve was created. But his legacy is the structure that makes today's $36 trillion in U.S. debt possible. The system was now in place: permanent government debt from 1694, tradable sovereign debt from the Rothschilds, central banks that could create money to buy government bonds from 1913. But there was still one constraint: gold. Until 1971, the dollar was backed by gold. Other countries could exchange dollars for gold at a fixed rate. This limited how much money the U.S. could create. Then came August 15th, 1971. President Richard Nixon appeared on television with a surprise announcement. He was closing the gold window. Effective immediately, the United States would no longer convert dollars to gold. No warning, no international consultation. Nixon unilaterally ended the Bretton Woods system that had governed global finance since 1944. This changed everything. From that moment, all currency became pure fiat, just paper and digits valued by trust alone. No gold backing, no commodity backing, just belief. Central banks could now create money far more freely. No gold constraint meant they could expand the money supply whenever they wanted. And they did. The result was the 1970s. High inflation, oil shocks, stagflation. But the genie was out of the bottle. Money was now completely controlled by central banks. They could print it, destroy it, manipulate interest rates, buy government bonds with created money. This gave them and governments a powerful but perilous tool, and it gave those who understood the new system an unprecedented advantage. Through the 1980s and 1990s, deregulation let the finance industry explode. Banks merged into giants. Derivatives markets created complex instruments that hardly anyone understood. Wall Street executives rotated into government positions. Treasury secretaries came from Goldman Sachs and returned to Goldman Sachs. The revolving door ensured that policies favored the financial sector. By the 2000s, the economy's health became synonymous with the stock market's health. The banking sector's stability became a national security issue. The trap was complete. Governments were now beholden to saving banks at all costs, because if the banks failed, the entire system collapsed. Let me show you the moments when the mask came off, when it became undeniable that money, not people, controlled the system. In 2008, major banks made catastrophic bets. They bundled bad mortgages into securities. They leveraged 30-1. They gambled with depositors' money, and they crashed the global economy. Housing markets collapsed. Stock markets plunged. Millions lost their homes. Unemployment spiked. Retirement accounts evaporated. The banks that caused the crisis should have failed. That's capitalism. Bad bets lose. But instead, governments around the world bailed them out. In all, the United States alone, $700 billion in TARP funds, trillions more in Federal Reserve interventions. The justification was too big to fail. If the banks collapsed, everything collapsed. So taxpayers, the victims, funded the bailout of the perpetrators. And here's the key. No top bankers went to jail. No executives faced criminal charges. They received bonuses. They kept their jobs. Some got promoted. The message was clear. If you're wealthy enough, connected enough, if you control enough of the system, you're above the law, the government will save you. Taxpayers will absorb the losses, and you'll walk away richer. This was the moment millions of ordinary people realized the system wasn't designed for them. It was designed to protect the financial elite at everyone else's expense. But the pattern had been set centuries before. In 1694, 1815, 1913. The 2008 bailout was just the latest confirmation. In 2010, the U.S. Supreme Court made it explicit. The Citizens United decision ruled that corporate and big donor spending in elections was protected free speech. Limits on campaign contributions were struck down. The floodgates opened. Unlimited money poured into politics. Super PACs spent billions. Dark money groups hid their donors. And suddenly, running for office became a fundraising competition. Let me give you a number. In U.S. House elections, the candidate who spends more money wins 94% of the time. 94%. That means your vote, your voice, your preference matters in maybe 6% of races. The other 94% are decided by who has more money. This isn't democracy. This is an auction. And the people who can afford to bid control the outcome. But it gets worse. Corporations discovered that lobbying has an extraordinary return on investment. One study found that some corporations achieved a 15,000% return on lobbying expenditures. They spent $1 on lobbying for tax breaks or favorable regulations. They got back $154 in benefits. That's a 15,000% return. Think about what this means. If you're a corporation, the best investment you can make isn't in research, innovation, or improving your product. It's in buying politicians. Because for every dollar you spend influencing legislation, you get $154 back. This creates a feedback loop. Money buys influence. Influence creates policies that benefit the wealthy. Those policies generate more money, which buys more influence, which creates more favorable policies. It's a self-reinforcing cycle, and ordinary people aren't part of it. This is what researchers call a success to the successful feedback loop. The initial advantage compounds. The rich get richer, the powerful get more powerful, and the system becomes impossible to break from the inside. In 2015, the trap revealed itself on a global stage. Greece. The Greek government had borrowed heavily. Decades of deficit spending, corruption, and mismanagement left the country drowning in debt owed to international creditors. The International Monetary Fund, the European Central Bank, and European Commission demanded austerity, cut pensions, slash public sector wages, raise taxes, sell state assets. The Greek people said no. In July 2015, they held a referendum. The question was simple. Do you accept the creditors' terms? 61% of Greek voters rejected the austerity package. 61%. A clear democratic mandate. The people had spoken. And then the Greek government ignored them. Within days, Prime Minister Alexis Tsipras, who had campaigned against austerity, accepted even harsher terms than the referendum rejected. Why? Because the alternative was being cut off from international finance. No more loans, no more bailouts, economic collapse. Greece couldn't pay public sector salaries, couldn't import food or medicine, couldn't function as a modern economy without access to international credit. So despite 61% of the population voting no, the government said yes. Democracy lost to the debt trap. This is the pattern in its purest form. The people vote. The money overrules them. Because when you're in debt, your creditors have more power than your citizens. You can hold elections. You can have referendums. But if the people with money say no, none of it matters. The Greek referendum should be taught in every civics class, not as a story about Greece, as a story about what democracy looks like when it collides with financial power. Democracy loses. Let me show you the research that proves this isn't just theory. In 2014, Princeton University professors Martin Gilens and Benjamin Page published a study that analyzed 1,779 policy outcomes in the United States over 20 years. They asked a simple question: who actually influences government policy? The results were stark. Economic elites and business interest groups have substantial independent impacts on U.S. government policy. The preferences of the average American appear to have only a minuscule, near zero, statistically non-significant impact on public policy. Read that again. The average American has near zero impact on policy. The wealthy have substantial impact. This isn't a democracy where the people rule. It's an oligarchy where the rich rule. The study's authors were careful with their language. They didn't use inflammatory terms. They presented data. But the conclusion was undeniable. In practical terms, the majority of Americans have no meaningful say in what their government does. When the wealthy want a policy, they usually get it. When average citizens want a policy that conflicts with elite interests, they usually don't. The system is designed to look democratic. Elections, campaigns, debates, voting. But the outcomes are predetermined by who has money, and the people with money make sure the system stays that way. This is the trap at its peak. Everyone participates in the performance of democracy. We vote, we argue about candidates, we watch the news. But beneath the surface, the actual decisions are made by those who fund the campaigns, who lobby the legislators, who control the financial system. You're watching theater. The script was written before you bought the ticket. Now let me show you the mechanism, how the trap actually works in your daily life. You're born into a world where everything costs money: housing, food, education, healthcare. Necessities aren't free. They're commoditized. To get money, you work. But most jobs don't pay enough to cover the costs up front. So you borrow. Student loans to get educated, car loans to get to work, mortgages to have shelter, credit cards to manage the gap between paychecks. By the time you're 30, you're carrying $50,000, $100,000, maybe $200,000 in debt, and you'll spend the next 30 years paying it off with interest. Let's do the math on a typical life. College, $150,000 in student loans. Car, $30,000 loan. House, $400,000 mortgage at 6% interest. Over 30 years, that mortgage doesn't cost $400,000. It costs $863,000, more than double the principal. Where does that extra $463,000 go? To the bank. As interest. That's the trap. You borrow the money you need to live, you spend your working life paying it back, and the interest payments transfer your wealth to the financial institutions. Multiply this by 330 million Americans. Then by 8 billion people globally. The wealth transfer is staggering. Trillions of dollars flowing from workers to capital every year, forever. And it's not called theft, it's called interest. The beauty of the trap is that it feels voluntary. You chose to take the loan, you agreed to the terms. Nobody forced you. But the alternative was what? Not going to college, not having transportation, not having shelter. The necessities of life are locked behind paychecks you can't get without debt. The trap isn't optional, it's structural, and inflation makes it worse. When central banks create money, when they expand the money supply, the currency loses purchasing power. Your savings buy less, your wages buy less, the cost of living rises. But who benefits from inflation? Debtors. The government owes $36 trillion. Inflation erodes the real value of that debt. If prices double, the debt is worth half as much in real terms. The government prints money, pays back old debts with cheaper dollars, and the burden shrinks. Who loses from inflation? Savers, the middle class, people on fixed incomes, anyone holding cash or bonds, their purchasing power evaporates. This is a stealth wealth transfer from savers to debtors, from the middle class to the government, from workers to asset owners. And it's invisible to most people because it happens slowly. Groceries cost a little more, gas costs a little more, rent goes up, wages stagnate, but there's no single moment of theft. Just a slow erosion of purchasing power over decades. The trap is global. Every developed nation runs the same system. Permanent government debt, central banks creating money, financial sectors dominating policy, and the people who control the bonds, who manage the debt, who collect the interest, they're the ultimate beneficiaries. Let me show you who they are. BlackRock, Vanguard, State Street. These three asset management firms control over $20 trillion in assets. That's more than the GDP of the United States. They're the largest shareholders in almost every major corporation. They own significant portions of the banks, the tech companies, the pharmaceutical companies, the defense contractors, and they hold enormous amounts of government bonds. When the U.S. pays $1 trillion in interest annually on the national debt, a significant portion flows to these firms. Not because they're evil, because they manage money for pension funds, retirement accounts, insurance companies. They're the intermediary through which wealth flows from taxpayers to bondholders. Here's the mechanism. You pay taxes. The government uses those taxes to make interest payments on the debt. Those payments go to whoever holds the bonds. The bondholders are institutional investors. The institutional investors are managing money for wealthy individuals and large funds. It's a transfer from the many to the few, from workers to capital, from taxpayers to bondholders, and it never ends, because the debt is never repaid. It's just rolled over. New bonds replace old bonds. Interest payments continue, forever. This is what 1694 created. This is what the Rothschilds industrialized. This is what the Federal Reserve perfected. And this is what we live in today. So what can be done? Can the trap be escaped? History suggests it's extraordinarily difficult, because the trap is self-perpetuating. Those with power use it to protect their power. Those with money use it to make more money. And the structures, laws, regulations, they're all designed to maintain the system. But there have been attempts. Throughout history, reformers have tried to fight back. President Eisenhower warned of the military-industrial complex. The moneyed defense industry, influencing policy, perpetuating wars to generate profits. His warning was ignored. The McCain-Feingold Act in 2002 tried to limit campaign finance. It was undermined by Citizens United in 2010. The Dodd-Frank Act, after 2008, tried to regulate banks. It was weakened by industry lobbying and regulatory capture. Every reform faces the same problem. The people with money fight it. They hire lobbyists. They fund opposition campaigns, they threaten economic consequences, and they usually win. Because they have resources, reformers don't. So the trap persists. But the awareness is growing. After 2008, millions of people woke up to how the system works. After Citizens United, more people understood money's role in politics. After Greece, more people saw how debt overrides democracy. The scholars who published the oligarchy research did so to spark reform. Their conclusion was blunt. Meaningful campaign finance reform is the most promising avenue for change. Get money out of politics, publica, financing of elections. Strict limits on lobbying, transparency, and who funds what. These aren't radical ideas. They're about restoring the basic principle that people, not money, should control government. Some activists push for alternatives. Decentralized cryptocurrencies that can't be manipulated by central banks. Public banking to circumvent Wall Street. Local currencies to build community wealth. These are experiments, testing whether systems can be built that resist capture. But the trap fights back. Bitcoin gets regulated, public banking gets blocked by financial sector lobbying. Local currencies can't compete with the scale of the dollar. The resistance is real, because the system knows its greatest enemy is awareness. Once enough people see the trap, once they understand how it works, they can refuse to be complicit. They can demand change. They can build alternatives. That's why exposure matters. That's why research like the Princeton study matters. That's why documentaries and investigations matter. They make the invisible visible. They show the puppet strings, and once you see them, you can't unsee them. Here's what you need to understand. The takeover wasn't violent. It was quiet. It happened over centuries. 1694, 1815, 1910, 1971, 28, 2010. Each step seemed reasonable at the time. Create a central bank to manage government debt. Make debt tradable to create liquid markets. Expand the money supply to stimulate growth. Bail out banks to prevent collapse. Allow free speech in elections. Each decision made sense in isolation, but together they built a system where money controls everything, and the people who designed each piece knew exactly what they were doing. William Patterson knew that permanent debt gives creditors eternal leverage. The Rothschilds knew that tradable debt creates control through complexity. J.P. Morgan knew that a central bank gives bankers power over the money supply. Nixon knew that fiat currency allows unlimited money. Creation. The architects of Citizens United knew that unlimited money would determine elections. These weren't accidents. They were features. Deliberate design choices that concentrated power in the hands of those who control money. And the result is what we have today. $337 trillion in global debt. Governments that serve financial interests over citizens. Elections won by whoever spends more. Economic policy decided by those who will profit from it. A system where your vote matters less than someone else's checkbook. This is the trap. And it's not a conspiracy theory. It's documented history, public record, published research. The meetings happened. The laws were passed. The data exists. You can verify every claim I've made. The question isn't whether the trap is real. The question is what you do now that you know. Money's quiet rule means that most of the problems we see, political dysfunction, wealth inequality, corporate power, regulatory failure, they're not separate issues. They're symptoms of the same underlying cause. Follow the money. Every time. When a policy that benefits the few keeps getting passed, ask who paid for it. When a reform that would help the many keeps failing, ask who's blocking it. When elections produce leaders who govern for the wealthy, ask who funded their campaigns. The answers always lead back to money, and money always leads back to those who control it. The financial sector, the bondholders, the lobbyists, the donors. The system isn't broken, it's working exactly as designed. To concentrate wealth, to extract value from the many and transfer it to the few, to ensure that power remains with those who have money, and to make escape nearly impossible. Because once you're in debt, once you're dependent on the system, once you need the currency they control, you're trapped. You can work, you can vote, you can participate, but you can't change the fundamental structure without permission from those who benefit from it. That's the system trap. And it's why reform is so hard. You can't vote your way out of a system where votes are purchased. You can't regulate industries that control the regulators. You can't fight money with elections funded by money. The trap is total. But here's the thing about traps. They require ignorance to function. The Greek referendum failed because the government knew what would happen if they defied the creditors. The 2008 bailout happened because people didn't understand how the system worked until after. Citizens United passed because most people didn't realize what unlimited money in politics would do. But now we know. We've seen the pattern. We have the research. We understand the mechanism. And that knowledge is power. Not the power to overturn the system overnight, but the power to resist, to build alternatives, to demand transparency, to support reforms, to spread awareness. The system's greatest vulnerability is that it depends on complexity and obscurity. Once people see through it, once they understand how it works, the legitimacy cracks. And without legitimacy, even the most powerful system eventually falls. The strings are visible now. The pattern is clear. Money took control quietly, systematically, over 330 years. From the Bank of England to Jekyll Island to Citizens United. From permanent debt to tradable bonds to unlimited campaign spending. Each step tightened the trap. Each innovation concentrated power. Each decision favored those who already had wealth. And the result is a world where elections are auctions, where debt is eternal, where the average person has near zero influence on policy, where democracy is theater and money writes the script. 3 times the pattern played out, 3 centuries of consolidation, and we're living in the 4th act right now. The question is whether this time will be different, whether awareness can break the cycle, whether enough people seeing the trap means we can start dismantling it. The pattern says otherwise. The math says otherwise. History says those with power don't surrender it willingly. But history also says that every empire, every oligarchy, every system that concentrated power eventually faced accountability. Rome fell. Monarchies fell. Robber barons were regulated. Jim Crow ended. Apartheid ended. Systems change when enough people demand it, when the cost of maintaining the system exceeds the cost of changing it. We're not there yet, but we're moving. The awareness is spreading. The research is public. The pattern is visible, and once you see it, you can't go back to believing the performance. You know the system is a trap. You know money controls it. You know your vote alone won't change it. But you also know that collective action can, that movements can, that awareness spreading to millions can. That's what terrifies the system. Not individual resistance, collective understanding. When enough people see the trap, when enough people refuse to accept it, when enough people demand that democracy means something more than choosing between candidates, both funded by the same donors, the system has to respond. Not because it wants to, because it has to. That's the only way traps break. From the outside. From people who refuse to stay trapped. From knowledge that spreads faster than the system can suppress it. The takeover was quiet. But the resistance doesn't have to be. The pattern says money wins. But patterns can be broken. If enough people understand how the trap works, if enough people demand something different, if enough people refuse to accept that this is just how things are, the system trap is real. It's documented. It's functioning right now, but it's not invincible. It's not eternal. It's maintained by acceptance, by ignorance, by the belief that there's no alternative. Once that belief cracks, once people see that the trap is a choice, not a law of nature, everything changes. And we're at that point now. The research exists. The evidence is clear. The pattern is visible. What happens next depends on whether we stay in the trap or whether we use what we now know to break free. Money quietly took control over 330 years. The question is whether we'll quietly accept it for the next 330, or whether we'll do something different. The pattern says we won't. But this time, we see the pattern. And seeing it changes everything. If you want more breakdowns like this, subscribe. I'm mapping the pattern in every major collapse.